Hello everyone, Bag here. Today, I'm trying something a bit different from the usual business of my channel, as I want to take a deep dive into the inner workings of an upcoming unit in order to try and answer some of the most common questions that surrounds them. Today, that unit is Aglaea, which you read the title. Also, Future Bag here. As I'm uploading this, I'm realizing that I pronounced her name as Aglaea instead of Aglaea this entire video. I am not re-recording this entire thing, so apologies in advance for me temporarily sticking to how I pronounced her name before we knew what it sounded like. Okay, back to the vid. Aglaea's teammate options that let her work at her fullest potential are rather limited, and in my opinion, the options that you have for her on your account are the most important factor when deciding whether or not to pull for her. So today, I will be putting every teammate she could realistically have into a tier list, so that you can just look at whoever is on your account and line them up with whoever is tiered here. Let's not stall any longer and get straight into things. The number one thing to know about Aglaea is that she is very energy hungry. Her very high cost ultimate of 350 not only gives her an immediate extra turn, but it also gives her an enhanced state that allows her to use an enhanced joint basic with her memo sprite, Garment Maker. This enhanced basic is the vast majority of her damage, so doing as much of it as possible is the name of the game. The thing is, her ultimate has a timer on it, like Firefly or Robin, and if the timer runs out, Garment Maker dies and Aglaea is reverted to her base form. Garment Maker dying is really bad, as it loses all but one of its speed stacks, and depending on your team comp, it might take a lot of time for Garment Maker to get its speed back. So what you want to do to avoid Garment Maker dying is to chain ultimates together with Aglaea. You can use her ultimate within her enhanced state to reset the timer on the state and take another immediate turn. If she can stay within her enhanced state forever, and she is able to take as many turns as possible, then she will be in her strongest form. All of this ties back to her needing to satisfy her very large energy costs to make this ultimate spamming playstyle happen. So with that in mind, let's look at what teammates enable her the best. The top two supports for her right now are Sunday and Huohuo, for what should be relatively obvious reasons. Sunday not only has energy within his ultimate that scales based on the unit's max energy, but he also advances forward and buffs both Aglaea and Garment Maker. Garment Maker does generate energy for Aglaea when it attacks, so Garment Maker taking more actions is another way of generating energy. This action advancing also helps Garment Maker get its stacks quickly at the start of the fight, and this combined with Sunday's first ultimate of the fight can help drastically in getting Aglaea into her first ultimate. Reducing that ramp up time can save an entire cycle depending on the enemy formation, so suffice to say that he fulfills a very important role. While Aglaea can work without Sunday if you have enough of her other good teammates, he is by far the largest difference maker in her performance. Huohuo is another obvious choice for a teammate, as her ultimate is also an energy buff that scales on the unit's max energy. This is also an AoE attack buff that buffs Garment Maker as well, while also giving energy to important teammates such as RMC or Sunday. The basic advice that is parroted around when talking about Aglaea is that she really needs one of three things to feel decent about her energy. She either needs Sunday, Huohuo, or her E1. Having Sunday and Huohuo is nice too, but having only one of the two should be good enough as well. I am never really someone to recommend Eidolons to anyone who is not absolutely dedicated to a unit, but I will say that Aglaea without any premium energy buffers is rather scuffed. It's still for sure workable, but you will quickly realize that she will not be on the same level as other new carries, such as the Herda with her cheap teammates. So yeah, the two non-Eidolon pillars of Aglaea's teams are at the top here. There are units who still work well with her to fill out the other free team slots, but no one comes close to these two in terms of their importance. Next, we have two units who are pretty close together, Robin and RMC. The basic idea is that Robin is a bit better than RMC most of the time, but since the gap between them is rather small, it might make sense to put Robin on your other team where she could make more of a difference, depending on how cracked out your Aglaea team already is. If you do need to use Robin and RMC together, it can work, and I would say that it's Aglaea's best non-Sunday team. But Huohuo is again the real difference maker here to make it work smoothly. Robin's team-wide action advancing can prolong how long Aglaea spends in her ultimate, while also giving Garment Maker a free turn, which one turn isn't that important in the grand scheme of things, but it is a small boon to note. Robin action advancing the whole team means that she can push forward other action advancers, like Sunday, as we've seen the Robin-Sunday pairing already working very well with a lot of other teams. The Huohuo-Sunday-Robin core, otherwise known as HSR, has already picked up a lot of steam, and Aglaea seems to be the peak of this core's performance. RMC, meanwhile, is essentially just a light version of Sunday. They have an occasional action advance, they buff both the Memo Sprite and the Memo Master, and their proportional true damage is good at buffing literally any conventional carry in the game, which means that Aglaea is no exception. This is also currently the only way to make use of RMC's E2, for what that's worth as well, so that's some nice utility. Again, a team of Robin, RMC, and Ho-Ho should work well together, although you may still need to run an ER rope on Aglaea to tide over her energy needs more thoroughly. If you take nothing else away from this video, essentially any combination of these tiered units will be essentially her best team, especially if it has Sunday. So if you have none of these 5 stars or only Robin, you might want to at the very least reevaluate your expectations with how Aglaea will perform. Now that we've gone through the top tiers, things will be a bit faster as we go through every other sustain and carry in the game. Gallagher's SP generation is not really needed at all, since Aglaea is not SP intensive in the slightest, but his ability to consistently proc quid pro quo makes him the second best sustain by default. The buffs that the other premium options give are just not as important as the energy that he can provide. Aventurine, Fushuan, and Ling Sha are all decent sustainers, assuming you have Sunday to make Ho-Ho's absence not as damning. Aventurine has an easier time sustaining than Fushuan given the presence of a Memo Sprite, but her team-wide field is able to buff Garo Maker as well. Here, I would like to note 2 things. For one, debuffs are a pretty nice way to buff Aglaea, since both Garo Maker and Aglaea can make use of them. So, besides buffs that specifically targets both of them, or buffs that cover the entire team, this is the 3rd best option for damage amping for both her and Garo Maker. The other thing to note is that the new enemies of Amphorius have an armor mechanic that gives energy when the armor is broken. This energy is given only to the unit who breaks the armor, so constant AoE attacks from the likes of Ling Sha might be a bit difficult to play around, or they might open up the possibility for Aglaea to get easier armor breaks. It really just depends on how well you can play in the end. This enemy energy mechanic also means that lower energy teams might be temporarily fine in endgame scenarios that have these enemies, as they are the generic enemies of the new world, and so they will presumably be around for at least a little while. Don't rely on them to shore up your team's weaknesses, but, well, they will help to shore up your team's weaknesses. So there's that. Bronya is a unit that varies pretty wildly in her usefulness depending on multiple factors. She meshes well with how not SP hungry Aglaea is, and Bronya's E2 can give Aglaea enough speed to reach some rather difficult speed thresholds without her signature. What might be the best use for her though is to action advance Sunday instead. Since Sunday is mostly SP neutral, using Bronya to bring him up really costs nothing extra. This lets Sunday cycle through his ultimate faster while letting him re-bring up Garo Maker as well. You can then also give the E2 buff to him if you're trying to speed tune a fast Sunday with minimal substats. The only disadvantage with this is that you aren't giving any of Bronya's buffs to Aglaea besides her ultimate, so it's more of a quantity over quality playstyle in terms of her amount of attacks. It's a pretty decent pairing, but honestly, RMC works well enough as a secondary support to Sunday to where it's not really needed most of the time. It's just a fun team idea that might be optimal under very specific account scenarios. Ting Yun is the budget option for Aglaea, with her energy funneling ultimate and her skill being rather spammable with the lack of SP usage from Aglaea. The main downsides are, of course, that her buffs don't buff Garo Maker, and that she doesn't have any action advancing outside of DDD. DDD is nice, but this package doesn't really compare with what RMC can bring. If you are reduced to using RMC and Ting Yun, this comp can work if you have Ho-Ho, but even then it might be a bit underwhelming compared to what you would expect from a new carry. This is basically the lowest I would go in terms of low budget teams, while still calling them workable at a high level. Ranmei works, I guess? She gives speed, and her buffs do go to the entire team, but Aglaea wants teammates who do more than just damage. Action advancing and energy are just too important for her, and Ranmei basically gives neither of those things. If you want raw damage numbers, then she is not bad, but I'd find her hard to recommend as a first or second option for her team. Pela, too, is a generic damage amper that really doesn't do much besides damage. There's really nothing else to say. I guess she can spam her skill more easily for higher ultimate rotations, but that's really it. Jiaoshu goes right above her as they are very similar units within this context. Unfortunately, Aglaea doesn't do any damage with her ultimate itself, so she can't make use of a lot of his actual damage amping, but his AoE debuffs are nice in a general sense, I guess. Sparkle is mostly just outclassed by Branya as a secondary action advancer, and I wouldn't really say that she is that capable of being a replacement for Sunday as the primary advancer, since, again, she gives no energy and can't buff Garment Maker, and her SP is just completely overkill and is largely unneeded. Moving to the C tier, Asta is not a terrible option, since speed is a rather powerful option for Aglaea, and Asta will be able to have a high uptime with spamming skills. The problem really is just that Asta's buffs are rather underwhelming when compared to other options, and she, say it with me everyone, has no energy buffing potential, which makes her worse than Tingyun in most scenarios when used alongside RMC. Luocha is mostly just worse Gallagher due to the less frequent Crypto Crocs. He just heals and does nothing else, so in turn, there's really nothing else to say about him. And lastly, Silverwolf is mostly just inferior to Pela due to her debuffs being single target, which don't work well with Aglaea's constant blast attacks. However, this is really less about any real anti-synergy between the two of them, it's just that Silverwolf is not that optimal of a generic support for most carries nowadays, sadly. Finally, we reach the D tier, which is just every other sustain that is not already mentioned, as well as Yukong and Hanya. It will be absolutely impossible to maintain uptime on Yukong's buff, as she favors slow but strong attacks, which Aglaea has the opposite of. And Hanya's SP generation is mostly not needed, and her speed buff is good, but generally less important than Tingyun's energy generation. In general, the budget options for Aglaea are rather bottlenecked, around them just being worse than the combination of Tingyun and RMC. This by itself is also not that great of a core for her without Ho-Ho, but it also is just better than most of the other things that you can do with the rest of the budget cast. And on that note, that's the list. I'll end this off by saying that this should only really influence your usage of Aglaea if you actually care about using her in an optimal scenario. If you just want to do a 5-cycle clear with your favorite new Amphoreus character, then the less optimal teams should still do just fine. A team being scuffed shouldn't dissuade you from using them if you play this game for the characters. But please, try to be realistic with yourself on how much you will get out of her. The worst thing that can happen is if you end up being disappointed with something that you were hyped up about. Please spend responsibly, and of course, when you have a chance to make a choice, make one that you know you won't regret. Make sure to subscribe for more if you want to see more of this type of content, and follow my Twitch for whenever I'm live. We've been having a lot of fun with the recent streams, and I'd be very glad if you joined us. Within the context of what's going on in the part of the world where I'm from right now, I also want to say trans rights are human rights, and I hope that all of you that are going through tough times right now have the ability to stay safe and get any support that you need. I hope you all have a great rest of your day. Bye!